смотрят.
Да, мы потом посчитаем и пришлем вам в конце, да.
Окей, хорошо.
Один момент. Дело в том, что трансляция закончится не сразу после того, как закончится обсуждение. Может идти несколько секунд. Мы просим вас не выходить из кадра до сигнала.
Дорогие друзья и уважаемые коллеги, приветствую.
Dear colleagues and friends, I'm very happy to welcome you to our discussion. Our today's talk will be part of the Museum Guide program held by Vladimir Potanin Foundation in partnership with ICOM Russia as part of Intermuseum Festival. We would like to express our gratitude to Vladimir Potanin Foundation for making all of this possible. Hopefully, you are sitting comfortable in front of the screens of your computers or mobile phones. But before we start our discussion, I would like to ask every one of you to remember a moment of an encounter with a museum that left something memorable for you. What made this experience so memorable? I do have such moments, and maybe every one of us has an imaginary museum in their memory, in their mind, which we carry with us wherever we go, something that supports us. And this is directly related to the topic of our today's discussion, which is museums as therapeutic resources. And it's an invitation for a conversation. This topic is extremely acute today when, with the background of the pandemic of COVID-19, museums have to mobilize all of their resources to become more accessible for people, remind the history of resilience, self-help, and learning throughout the human history. All of these beautiful things can be found in museums, of course. Today, we want to invite you to think together with us about how museums react to contemporary challenges, how museums see their social role, and how they create the environment that can have a therapeutic effect. These questions, over the past 20 years, shifted from the peripheral museum debates to the epicenter of the professional community discussions. The topic of this forum is Museum as Sustainable Development, and it's not an accident that the question of museums as therapeutic resources emerged in relationship with the Sustainable Development Agenda. Museums and Sustainable Development, the document that you may have already read, words a very important line. Museums need to encourage cultural engagement for all and to increase the mental health and mental well-being of people. We all know that these problems, these issues have gone far beyond the healthcare. They have become part of our public discourse, the broad public discourse. How do museums contribute to the well-being of society? We know pieces of research held by the Scandinavian countries in 2000s, which proved that people who are actively engaged in culture have a higher quality of life. And maybe this factor of cultural engagement also influences the life expectancy. Museums all around the world are now revising their philosophy, their activities, and their roles in the society. And the issue of communicating with their audience is of utmost importance. It's all about inviting people into a dialogue. And in this dialogue, the voice of a museum emerges. A museum not as an expert or as a gatekeeper of knowledge, rather the voice of invitation to our shared construction of these meanings, to co-creation of meanings. These dialogues also give space to the voices that bring their stories to our museums. In some regard, this is new epistemology. This is new creation of knowledge or new formats of knowledge creation. Museums become catalyzers for public development. They find new partnerships and they create environment where diversity can be embraced and meaningful social connections can be established. Our brilliant speakers, who I will soon introduce, are going to share today their vision of the social role of museums. Is this role evident for the museum community? But maybe a more crucial question is, how do our audiences see us? Our speakers today represent different cultures, different languages, and different professions even, but they have something in common. They are willing to discuss our professional practices and share the best practices that we designed and to look for answers together. Here is the structure of our talk. Our dear speakers are going to give short presentations, and after that we'll have around 30 minutes for further discussion of museums as therapeutic resources. I encourage you to be proactive. Please send us your questions and we will try to answer as many as possible of them. I would love to introduce our panelists. They will introduce themselves in more detail before their presentations. The first speaker is our esteemed colleague, Elizabeth Ioannidis, education curator and art psychotherapist, National Museum of Contemporary Art, Athens, Greece. Roman Romanov, director of the Gulag History Museum, Russia. Stephen Lagari, art therapist, program officer, art therapy, Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, Canada. And Dinara Khalikova, project director, ICOM Russia, Moscow. Before we switch to the first presentation, I would like you to think about your position today. Where do you stand in relationship to this topic that we are speaking about? What is your professional and personal position? What are your thoughts and ideas and insights? And you're welcome to share them after this discussion. And I'm happy to invite our first speaker, Elizabeth Ioannidis, to share her presentation.
Hello, good afternoon. I hope you, your families, and your loved ones are all well. I want to thank you for this kind invitation to be part of this panel. I want to thank my fellow speakers and, of course, all of you watching us today. I'm an education curator and art psychotherapist at the National Museum of Contemporary Art in Athens, Greece. I have a dual role as an education curator. I deliver educational programs to primary premises and outside. And I also hold tours to the museum's exhibitions. I also design the primary school leaflets that accompany the exhibitions. In 2017, I inaugurated together with Mrs. Aphroditi Pandagoutsu the group art psychotherapy program Exploring the Museum's Images, Exploring My Image, which is held on a regular basis at the museum, and I'll talk about it a little bit further on. I also try to promote the application of art psychotherapy in museums and galleries through teaching and writing. Before I start, I want to give you a bit of background information about the National Museum of Contemporary Art in Athens, EMST, because we as a museum are accustomed to being closed or always in transition. Actually, we have a funny saying that normality is weird for us. The museum was founded in 1997 and began its operation in 2000. Next slide. Next slide. The original building was a brewery until the 1970s, and it had to be reconstructed to house the museum. Next slide. The reconstruction began in 2003, and we went back 11 years later in 2014. In the meantime, we had to find other locations to house our activity. Next slide. So we were hosted in the Athens Conservatory, the Athens School of Fine Arts, the Athens Concert Hall, and outdoor settings. We were a little bit like nomads, not knowing where we would be next and not able to plan ahead of time like most museums do. This meant that we were very adjustable. There were periods when we were closed and we had to be innovative in order to keep in contact with the public. Next slide. In 2009, as part of our social and educational role, my colleague, education curator Marina Tseku, designed the program EMST Without Borders. The objective of this endeavor is the elimination of social exclusion, the integration and creation of equal opportunities for access to art and culture for all, empowerment and connection, which are especially important in times of social, psychological, and physical trauma. So we work with prisoners, rehabilitation centers, refugees, the elderly who perhaps could not move, people in palliative care, etc. In 2016, although the museum was not in full operation, we opened with temporary exhibitions. Next slide. During that time, Greece was facing an economic crisis, so we wanted to provide a platform for people to process what was happening. A decision was made in 2017 to inaugurate a group art psychotherapy program entitled Exploring the Museum's Images, Exploring My Image, which is done in collaboration with Mrs. Aphroditi Padavoutsu in the first psychiatric department of the University of Athens. The reason I'm mentioning all this is that we're accustomed to not being in a fully operational museum to address the needs of the public. The museum finally opened its doors in February 2020, and 3 weeks later we had to close down because of lockdown. We had 11,000 visitors in these 3 weeks, which means that it was something very anticipated, but events caught up with us. I want to say that we must keep in mind that although the prevailing feeling is loneliness and isolation right now, not everyone is experiencing these times as traumatic or experience different forms of trauma. Some people see this as an opportunity to spend time with their families, get out of other situations that might be difficult for them in the office or at school, or some people are experiencing other forms of trauma, as we've seen from the rise in domestic violence and child abuse cases. So the way trauma is experienced right now is very different, but art appeals to everyone. And museums, through their programs, can provide a platform for any kind of expression and can create a safe environment for that expression. As I've explained, we've already embraced educational and learning practices to empower visitors to have a choice in their interpretation of art and their experience in our museum. And especially after mid-March and the lockdown, we saw a new urgency to create a space that would empower the public and, importantly, battle disconnection. As in all situations, context and resources play a vital part. It was important for us to engage our audience not as passive recipients, but as active participants. There are a lot of virtual tours to museums right now, to archaeological sites, to performances, but we wanted to find participants to find their own personal meaning in their engagement with the art. So having the knowledge of the past, we wanted to utilize our collection since that's the main asset of the museum, but we did not want to just drop bits of information about the works. A museum experience, in order to be trauma aware, starts when the lived experience of the visitor takes priority over art history. This holds both for the programs that were held during lockdown and when the public will be present in the museum space. So now we wanted to encourage participants to build personally meaningful pathways to connect with the art, which allows them in turn to connect to themselves. Slide. In the first program we develop, we urge our younger friends, age 4 to 13, 14, to explore the educational leaflets that were uploaded on the website of the museums. They were in Greek, and become creative. The name of an artist and their artwork were given, as well as the corresponding leaflet where they could find further information. And taking that as a starting point, that they would read together with their parents or on their own, and we urged them to create their own contemporary works, and they sent them to us and we would post them on the museum's social media. I want to show you a video that was inspired by a 7-year-old who created it with his aunt during the lockdown. The title is The Pirate Journey of the Century with My Aunt. So we can play the video. contemporary art inspires, evokes emotions, memories, and dreams, and certainly
и на то, чтобы почувствовать свою связь с миром,
that are being experienced right now.
почувствовать связь с теми событиями, которые происходят прямо сейчас. Следующий слайд, пожалуйста.
The other program we develop is for adolescents and adults. Title Each of Us is a work of art. The previous one, please. We post a story intertwined with works of the EMS collection as narrated by those who participated in the project Face Forward Into My Home. The participants in this project were refugees that were inspired by works in our museum's collection and narrated their personal stories as influenced by the artworks that we had discussed. Now we invite the public to listen to these stories and either be inspired by them or the artwork in our collection, which the story refers to. We then invite the audience to send us their stories anonymously or named, and we post them on our social media. The anonymity actually helps because it provides a safe space for people to express difficult feelings without the fear of being recognized. And it's very moving to read about people's thoughts and feelings during these difficult times because it gives you hope. You find someone who has the same feelings that you do. A 17-year-old wrote about Yadavas Sails, which is the work that you see on the right. The first impression I got from this work is that it represents the chaos in the internal world of each person. The way the sails are installed seem to declare internal conflicts between ideas, opinions, feelings, and ideologies that a person has. Our art psychotherapy program, unlike other programs held in museums around the world, is open to the general public. Even though nowadays many people find themselves in a very fragile psychological situation, we did not want to create an online art psychotherapy program, which is a bit more deep in the sense that in such a group you have to take more risks and deal with difficult issues that we did not want to do online. We're planning sessions once we return into the museum. Rather now, we wanted to create programs that would stimulate positive experiences that are resilience-based and pleasure-based in order to provide outlets to people to explore and express their lived experience. Of course, the contact with the artworks and socialization between people within the museum cannot be replaced by the online experience. But we're trying to provide incentives for people to come and experience the museum up close after the lockdown. We're all living in unprecedented times. There's a lot of grief with a lot of lives lost, a lot of money lost, and a future that is uncertain and unmapped for all of us. But it's a collective experience as we're all trying to make sense of it. And all this material that is currently circulating the internet, the books, the plays, has highlighted the importance of art in our lives. Now, the day after the lockdown, slide, the American Alliance of Museums conducted a survey asking people how museums can help now and going forward. Slide, well, I would say that it's due to this horrid situation, people need to feel capable instead of helpless. They need to be part of something big, meaningful, and have a sense of control again. As for museums, as the survey showed, they can show hope by keeping on with their mission, sharing their struggles, and being proactive in providing services to people. I would say that the artworks are what make museums ideal places for healing. We all can relate in some form to works of art. Also, walking through a museum, the actual physical movement that is required to looking at artworks and walking through the museum spaces can be helpful to process things. With tourism impacted for some time to come, maybe museums could think more locally. How can they better connect with local communities? How can they focus on helping local people in surviving this crisis together? We also need to think of our vulnerable groups. The coronavirus is of particular concern to older audiences, many of whom are regular visitors. So maybe offer special visiting hours for this group. For example, the first couple of hours in the morning could be reserved for those over 70. Another thing that is very helpful is giving information about the precautions that you have taken as a museum, both on the website and the actual physical space. So that not everyone's allowed in the gallery at the same time, that there's appropriate ventilation in the building, everything is sanitized. This information actually calms people down. Our work as education curators and therapists requires more empathy and action on our part to ensure that museums are truly for all communities. Slide. We can talk about other things that can be done later in the discussion, but we should not forget that although art cannot undo what is happening, it can certainly help us move forward. Thank you.
I would like to highlight one important thing that Elizabeth has mentioned during her presentation, the importance of personal stories in the museum sector. It is also very important for the work of Russian museums. This focus on personal stories and on this interaction when people are giving their personal experience, and this experience is created in interaction with the cultural heritage. And now I invite our following speaker, Roman Romanov, director of the Museum of the Gulag History. Thank you very much, Nana. And I would like to thank the organizers of this session and all the colleagues who took part in this event, and also for the choice of our topic, museums as therapeutic resources, is a very topical theme, I think. Well, I will try to explain it also during my presentation. Please switch my presentation.
Наш музей основан в...
Our museum was founded in 2004, and first visitors came in 2004. And in my presentation, I would like to explain our topic. Next slide, please. A museum means people, and also people who are involved, who are engaged. There are some colleagues who are on this picture, and also some objects were made really by the hands of these people. These are our common values. Next slide, please. Our museum moved to another place because in the beginning it was really small, but in 2015 we reopened our museum in a new building. This building is not connected to Gulag or to repressions, and the building was reconstructed, restructured. We understood that a museum devoted to such a topic is not only a museum, but it is also a center of social and volunteer work, also a platform where you can ask questions, where you can watch a movie or a play or take part in a discussion. Next slide, please. The main topic of our museum, it is Gulag and repressions. In my point of view, this trauma which happened with our country in the 20th century is still can be still felt today. So our mission and our responsibility is to work on this trauma and to research on this trauma, and also to show how we can move forward. Next slide, please. As each museum, our basis has its own collection, and these are objects related to different people. Our task is to tell the stories of the owners of these objects. Our exhibition is structured on the principle of showing different objects but also on the principle of showing personal stories. And our main exhibition is Gulag in personal stories of different people and in the history of our country. We have not only different objects. Well, this story happened not so long ago, and there are people who lived it, who lived it through, and we have a special project called My Gulag. We film video interviews with people who were in such concentration camps or who are victims of political repressions. There are now more than 300 interviews filmed by us. More than half of them is published online. You can watch them. And it is also a very important part of our main exhibition. Next slide, please. When we unite video interviews, objects, and other elements of our exhibition, we can show different modules devoted to various people. Yulia Pashaeva is one of the heroes of our modules. You can see it on the background. When we were creating this exhibition, we took some belongings of Yulia Pashaeva, and she also told her personal story. And now she was saying that she understands why she's still alive, because there were several cases in her life when she could die, and now she understands why she survived. And we wanted other people to learn her story, because we can explain it, we can show it. Such dramatic stories, such dramatic personal stories, they help to feel their feelings, and also they help to think about it. You can see the starting point of our exhibition. It's like a mix of different corridors, and we know that when people go through our exhibition, they have another understanding of the whole event. What are the technologies we use today in this regime of lockdown? We try to make public different online technologies, and it is virtual reality and also a guided tour in different camps, which are very remote, but we made a special VR film. Now such films are published in open source. We have not only VR films, but also special programs which are broadcasted on the internet. For example, the project of Gulag Map is represented in our main exhibition in the museum and also on the internet. You can see on this map how the system of gulags were formed and transformed. And today there are a lot of researchers who use this map, and it is published online. I was talking about the fact that we register interviews, and such interviews, it is one of the dimensions of interaction with people who went through such concentration camps or other traumatic experiences. We understand that we cannot forget about them. It is our social responsibility, and we also have a special volunteer center, and our volunteers help these people in different situations. For example, during the lockdown, we can give them food or medicines, or we can provide psychological help to them. Research of different objects. You know, gulags camps were situated in different parts of our country, and there were a lot of camps situated in remote areas, and we try to find different objects, and we organize such expeditions. And now one of the direction of our activity is to preserve these objects. We communicate with local governments, and we ask them to provide security to these places.
It's not only about objects, it's also about the family history, reconstructing the family history. We have a documentation center, and people can turn to this center to find info about their perished relatives, and we provide information. The research is very complicated, but our center takes on that responsibility. As for our work, we have a community formed around us, multidisciplinary community, artists, teachers, educators, and people who want to help the people that are persecuted for political reasons. We have volunteers who work with the people we help. The next slide, please. We strive to make our influence as broad as possible. We go beyond the walls of our museum, and the lesson in memory, for example, is a lesson on learning to speak about this painful past. This is a lesson plan that any educator can use, but we also do film screenings, traveling exhibitions, memorial actions, and campaigns. So we are trying to broaden the range of our activities. We use completely different languages to convey the message, to communicate the results of our research. We use the language of art, like this graffiti portrait. The next slide, please. Graphic novels. The next slide. We create interactive curriculum, inclusive curriculum for different visitor groups. The next slide, please. Theater performances, and one of our performances was awarded with the Golden Mask, which is the biggest award in Russia that lasts more than 100 years, based on a novel by Chingiz Aytmatov in 2018, was awarded the title of the best puppet show of the year. Publishing program, the next slide. And we invite school students to learn with us. We have an educational center which offers different programs for the young generation and for younger audiences. The next slide, please. And as for the challenges that we face today are huge, really. We see a huge number of people who are sure that the Stalin repressions never happened. They vindicate Stalin's actions, and they think that we are doing something wrong when we uncover all these stories. After the lockdown, our activities will be aimed at communicating the history of our country, persecutions. We want to rethink this history, to reflect on it, and to create a more complex perception of our past, leaving the sphere of trauma. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Roman. It was a brilliant example of how museums can work with the collective memory, a memory of a collective trauma and individual trauma. But the most important thing is how museums speak about complex things with different generations. Thank you very much for your presentation, and I'm happy to invite our next speaker, Stephen Lagari. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello from Montreal. I would like to just say in advance, we're having a heat wave, which is sometimes impacting power, and I apologize in advance if there's an interruption in my presentation. Could I see the slide, please? Could we go back to the first slide? Thank you very much. So my name's Stephen Lagari. I'm an art therapist and a family therapist. And for the last 3 years, I've been running a full-time program within a fine arts museum in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. And my personal program is dedicated to art therapy, but I'd also like to share with you a little bit of the history of program development at my museum, which touches on well-being, wellness, social inclusion, community outreach, and later my own program. And we're really trying to find a way to gather all of this activity and concept together. We're now beginning to call it museotherapy, or how we imagine exploiting, if you will, the museum resource for therapeutic purposes in various ways. And the excellent presentation by my two previous colleagues have already illustrated of such a dynamic ways that these are possible. And I think at the heart and the root of all of this is the belief and the experience that art objects and artifacts and the encounters with them are inherently and potentially therapeutic. Next slide, please. So welcome to Montreal. This is a metropolitan museum. The island has a population of about 2 million people and then another 2 million in the surrounding regions. It's located in downtown Montreal at the intersection of a lot of different socioeconomic situations. We're surrounded by both universities and hospitals, which has really given us a lot of opportunity for collaboration as we're talking about well-being, wellness, and therapy in museums. A lot of the credit goes to the innovation and the ingenuity of what our partners bring us in terms of their project and their research into the museum environment. Next slide, please. We're looking into the latest of 5 pavilions. This is called the Pavilion for Peace, which was funded by Renata and Mikhail Hornstein, both of whom were Holocaust survivors. And they dedicated a very large part of their fine art collection as well to be housed in this pavilion. The concept of a lot of more modern building can take into consideration the therapy of environments, the use of light, the use of space, how we gather, and now how we can also stay apart. It's Canada's oldest museum. It's the second most visited. We had just over 1 million visitors in 2019. That will, of course, change this year. And we hold and house an encyclopedic collection that goes as far back as antiquity, but then also features a fair bit of contemporary art. Next slide, please. Our own activities in community engagement and what really is the root of our own history in terms of therapeutic experiences in the museum goes back to about 20 years with a program that was called Sharing the Museum. And it began with the simple question of who is not coming to the museum and why? And if they did come, what would they like to do? And this gave birth to a great variety of different collaborations and formed the model that we continue to use, which is always to collaborate with a community, clinical, or association partner who helps us recruit participants, helps us understand their needs, and really helps co-create the different projects that we do together. Here we're seeing one of our about 5 different groups of patients living with Alzheimer's that come with their caregivers. This program is now about 7 years old. And it was inspired by Meet Me at the MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And that's also to illustrate that museums are not only resources for the public, but that we're resources for each other, that we can adapt and appropriate programs, be inspired by which each other person is doing, each other museum is doing, as we collectively work towards best practice. Next slide, please. My own house of activity is the International Atelier for Education and Art Therapy, named after the great donor Michel de la Chalalière. Montreal is predominantly French-speaking, as I didn't mention earlier, but it is also a very multicultural and multilingual city, and you can hear that daily in the museum when we're active. It is the largest area in a North American museum dedicated to education and therapeutic activity. Museums don't always think about expanding their education departments. We often look to new pavilions for collections. And so this is, I find, a really privileged example of what some innovation can lead to. We have 20 studios. We have a lot of areas dedicated for families, where they can gather for lunch, where they can gather to meet. We have a studio that's dedicated to therapeutic activity. And then we also have an art hive that I'll present in just a moment. Next slide, please. Each of these programs has its own project manager, and we're quite a large team of about 15 different program officers. Each of them has some link with some kind of therapeutic activity, whether it's directly doing therapy in my case, or using the museum for social inclusion, for well-being, for initiatives that build community partnerships. So well-being, inclusion, diversity, sharing the museum, all of these aim at reaching different audiences in different ways, but have as a commonality the use of the collection and the use of the museum for the betterment of the public. Next slide, please. In my own program, it's broken down into about 5 different kinds of activities. We have several groups that we run in different frequencies, sometimes weekly, sometimes monthly, and sometimes on demand. They include working with young adults on the autism spectrum, survivors of trauma. We have a bereavement group that we run twice a year. We also have a project working with a local clinic supporting people with communication problems. And this has led to a number of research collaborations. We've worked with a clinic for eating disorders, for people recovering from stroke, for people living with epilepsy, and then also more recently for people who have, well, women specifically living with breast cancer. Each of these is a co-created research project working with local hospitals and universities. We also train art therapists on site. We have 2 that come from a local university. We have both local, national, and international collaborations that produce different kinds of protocols, but then also end up looking like projects that we can put right on the ground in the museum. And then we have the Art Hive. Next slide, please. This is a rather unique studio in the ensemble of offering. It is open twice a week to anyone who wants to come, whether they're a museum patron or not, whether they visited a work in the museum or not. We see about 3,000 people a year, or about 100 to 1,200 people per, 100 to 200 people per week. It's a drop-in style. You don't have to reserve, and it's facilitated by an art therapist and one of our educators. It's a non-intervention model that's built around a philosophy of arts-based social inclusion that really underlines the autonomy of people to make the work that they need to make, sometimes as a response to what they've experienced in the museum, as a response to what they're experiencing in their own lives, or as in an effort to make social connections for those who are socially isolated. And on the best days, this really looks like a multi-generational studio where you have both children and seniors and everyone in between, and you can hear the sound of several languages being spoken. It's part of a network of art hives across Montreal. There are now more than 20, some in universities, some installed at the community level, and many have now gone online with a virtual hive offering. Next slide, please. This is an initiative that grew out of our many collaborations with the healthcare community. An association of doctors took a chance in 2018 to develop a specific museum prescription for their patients. These are mostly family physicians who could prescribe museum visit for an individual, for a family, for a couple, for friends. It was really up to the patient to decide how they wanted to use the prescription. And in its pilot year, we had a little more than 350 prescriptions filled. We were slated to move into a research phase this year, but that will have to take a pause as we slowly look towards reopening and seeing what kind of activities we can resume. Next slide, please. So since COVID, which has impacted the museum since March 17th when we closed our doors, like many museums and like the excellent examples that have just been presented, there's been a flurry of activity of moving things online, but also using what was already in existence. We have a platform called EduCart, which was designed for everything from elementary to college level teachers to be able to use the collections based on different themes. We then used that platform to send out to parents who were then in a position of doing homeschooling, and then also reconnected with teachers who moved to teaching online. In my own program, we began producing weekly capsules, if you will, mindful moments of looking at different artworks and encouraging people to make art in a more open-ended way. A number of our education experts have moved online as well, produced more structured activities, and the requisite encounters with some of our curators speaking about their work and their favorite works. I've been able also to move some pre-existing groups on to an online format. Elizabeth brought up the important point of a pre-established therapeutic relationship. So in those cases, I was able to adapt to an online model. And I'm hoping that this is going to be a model moving forward, as it may be a primary option for months and even years to come. Next slide, please. This is my final slide, and a word about sustainable development. We were fortunate to be mentioned in the ICOM OECD Guide for Local and Community, the Guide for Local Governments and Communities this past year. And a number of our programs were cited as examples of productive collaborations with local culture, but also how they feed back into the growth of the museum. One example was an ongoing collaboration with the annual Pride Parade. Another was our well-being programs around disability and accessibility, my own program of working with individuals who have been impacted by violent crime, and then a kind of an ensemble of how that is communicated to potential donors, as there's been a shift towards investing in projects and programs that directly impact and benefit the public. And this is a shift that I've seen from my own program as well. While donors remain heavily invested as well in the collections of the museum, it's really the direct contact with a more social justice initiative that seems to be gaining some momentum. Thank you very much.
Стивен, большое спасибо.
Steven, thank you very much for your presentation. You have talked about very important information. Your museum thought about what categories of people cannot come to your museum. And it is really very important to take account of categories of people who are not able to come to your museum and to make museum accessible for them. And another important topic you talked about is the partnership. So thank you very much. Now I would like to invite our following speaker, Dinara Halikova. She is the ICOM Russia project director. You have the floor. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Nana. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. I've listened to your presentations and I would like to share our experience, please. And for ICOM Russia, this direction is one of the priorities. In general, I can say that our goal is to help museum experts, museum specialists to build up their skills and potential needed to work with different social groups. We organize work with different museums and associations and our work is focused on different social groups, people with disabilities, refugees, people with migration experience, elderly people. And we think how a museum can work with all the people who are around it. Our work is interdisciplinary. We invite different experts, anthropologists, sociologists, therapists to our work, and we can make such an expert group. We've been working with a specific idea, which is the following. The principle of work with a specific social group is relevant for the work with any social groups, because practically each person nowadays can live through a kind of stress, and such therapeutical programs give us more and new possibilities, and they give us new tools to work with visitors and with our collections. Such approaches are focused on personal experience, on emotions and on feelings of a specific person. And the use of such tools helps to a museum to build up its potential and to form new relationships with different groups of people and to adapt to their needs. And so what happened with us nowadays and this period of crisis shows that really we need to adapt to the needs of each person, and we need to give people what they need at a specific moment. I would like to share the experience from my work and from the work of our partners. We develop several projects with them, and in a majority of cases I will talk about our work with people with disabilities. This topic is related to the theme of sustainable development, and that's why I highlighted different topics related to social work. And I would like to talk about the museum's contribution to the development of these topics. In the framework of our work, we try to analyze the engagement of people in our projects, and we want to know what is the motivation. And first of all, the first factor is emotional and social support. What can museum do? And what are the main principles which function online and also in real life? I think that such principles are related to our values. Well, museums can and should create spaces for dialogue and for the realization of one's potential. You can see several events organized by our partners during a Pan-Russian action Museum for All. You can see it on the slide now. During this project, different museums from all the regions of our country organize events for people with disabilities and also for other people who registered for these programs. We are glad that such programs are developed, and it is great when people with disabilities can co-create in the framework of such projects. For example, on the left image, you can see that they express themselves and they can share their experience. On the right image, you can see a special course which was developed for teenagers with psychological specific traits, and these young people could organize guided tours, and it was a tool of self-expression, and it was very important for the social contribution. Next slide, please. It is also very important to help visitors to feel that they are part of the local community. Sometimes, and I can say that even often, several social groups are invisible for other people who live near, who live close to to them. So that's why it is needed to create such spaces for illustration of their lives and to give them the right to say something, to make them feel that they are part of our whole community, that the museum also is part of their lives. Next slide, please. The possibility to express one's opinion is related to the point I've mentioned before. And this year, during the preparation of our initiative Museum for All, a well-known blogger, Lino Goralik, launched a media campaign in the framework of which people could write what they were told about disability when they were children. And we understood how many fears they had when they were children. So we understood that it is very important to say out loud what is important and to talk about disability. And we also offered to people with disabilities to talk about their experience, about their childhood, and about what they were told by adults about their state. So it was a dialogue between different players. The well-known principle, nothing for us without us, work together and empower. One of our last projects, it is an educational video with basic gestures in the sign language. It shows to the museum employees what gestures they can use, what signs they can use to communicate with people with disabilities who cannot hear them. It is also a very important issue because very often we are talking about what a museum can give to visitors, but we also need to learn what visitors can give to us. And we see that the community can share their experience and they can build up the potential of museum employees. And it also helps visitors to feel that their experience is important and that they can talk about something important. And what about the period of lockdown? We need to talk about topical themes and to live in the today's reality. So I would like to describe our following project. We offered to people with disabilities to talk about their experience during the crisis. It is also a project realized with our partner. And other participants said that the participation in museums programs gives them the feeling that they are linked to the reality, that they still have what they like.
And a couple of words about how we are going to work after the lockdown. I believe that we can use the challenges and turn them into advantage. We think that we have to take with us into the future the best practices that we have designed now, but at the same time, we have to honestly look at the problems that arose and deal with them too. I think crisis is a great time for uncovering all of these challenges, so it's a great opportunity for development. Thank you very much, Dinara. I think that your presentation voiced fundamentally important points for our panel, for our discussion. Our work with socially vulnerable groups of people, I think that the approaches you have highlighted are especially relevant for any type of audience, really. So it's all scalable. Another thing, another important point you mentioned are competences that museum professionals need for this kind of work. Now, I would suggest to shift into the discussion. We don't have too much time, just 15 minutes for that. I want to express my gratitude again to you for going through your presentation. And now I want to give voice to our audiences because we've been speaking for a long time, and I want to ask you some questions from our audiences. We received quite a lot of questions and a lot of words of gratitude, actually, to you, to our speakers. The first question is to Elizabeth. A beautiful presentation. Thank you very much. What therapeutic goals do you set for yourself for the period after the lockdown? Why will the audience be interested in your work? And why should they come after the lockdown? And could you please speak in more detail about the space for social connections that you create?
Well, we go to museums because we want to feel connected. So we want to build an environment where there is safety, there is trust for our visitors, there is patience, reciprocity. So we want to create a place where they will feel safe and welcome to come. We have to consider that we must not forget that even though we're going to start opening slowly, and some museums have already opened, it's not going to be the same anymore. And we all are aware of that. We're moving a little bit into a hybrid situation where half our services will be physical, some will be virtual. And in a lot of surveys that we read now, many visitors are actually reluctant in going back to closed spaces. So we need to create an environment where people will feel safe to visit, physically safe, and emotionally safe. We need to create programs that will consider all the parameters that have been imposed and given to us, hygiene parameters, but also make them feel emotionally safe to express themselves, their feelings, give a platform for them to process what was happening, because many of the people, most of the people didn't have the time to process what has happened. So it's important to consider that. Another issue that maybe we don't consider is that even though the world suddenly has become smaller and we're feeling more connected to each other, there's a big issue of inequality that's being raised. There are a lot of people who don't have access to the internet, the computer. They have one computer at home. There are people in remote locations that don't have access to all this information that's out there. So even though it seems that we're more connected than ever, there's a group of people that are actually left out. And this group of people have also need to find a space once we open up. So I don't know if that answers the question or if there's...
Спасибо, Elizabeth.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. And I think it leads us to the next question, which I would like to address to Roman. Roman, I know that you work a lot online now with younger audiences, so my question would be, the young generation, the digital nomads, is it easier for them to adapt to the situation? Have you carried out any research about that? Well, we didn't do any research as such, but we can see that our offline talks were attended by 30, 50, or 100 people physically in the physical space. Now, some of the talks or some of the guided tours are watched by thousands of people online. And for the guided tours, also hundreds of people join them online. So it means that actually the number of visitors has grown manifold. Thank you very much for this answer. Another question which we have from the audience, how will the dynamics of the interaction change between museums and the audience? Let us think about that, and I will go to the next question addressed to Stephen. Stephen, what are the results for the museum therapy? Are there any tangible results of museum therapy? I suspect that this question is connected to maybe, the ways of evaluating the efficiency of your programs. So, Stephen, can you hear us? Are you here?
Thank you. I can tell you that depending on which population we're looking at, the research demonstrates that the museum therapy either functions as an effective primary therapy, that is, if the individuals aren't being followed clinically somewhere else, such as the case that was shown in our breast cancer study, or it can function very well as an allied therapy. That is, if individuals are being followed clinically, the museum then serves as this very, I would even say, powerful adjunct where the therapeutic goals of the patients can be practiced in the museum setting, which I think we have a kind of collective agreement that it is a safe enough space. So depending on the goals of the individual patients, we can then use the museum as a place to kind of act that out. On a more general level, our studies into art, social inclusion, museums, and aging are showing that older adults are showing decreases in symptoms of depression, of felt sense of social isolation, and are going to be reporting fewer visits to their doctor. That particular study is now being replicated in 5 museums across the world and helmed by a doctor of gerontology here in Montreal, Dr. Baucher. So far so good for the therapeutic impact of the museum.
Тогда еще один вопрос.
Then one more question to you, Stephen. People 65 plus, older than 65, they now have to be more isolated than others. They have to stay home because they are in the risk group. Can we take that into account when we design museum programs?
Absolutely. I also know some, because I'm doing some work with some older adults, a lot of them are quite keen to get back to the museum. While they know that they are a high-risk public, some of them are even tired of being told this message. They were volunteers, they were working, they were very active in their communities, and they were fierce patrons of the museum. And I think that as we slowly, very slowly, and very carefully open the museum, sort of one door at a time and one exhibit at a time, and we can demonstrate that it is primarily on a health level a safe place to visit, we're not only going to see a return of our older adults, but we're going to see them have some very informed opinions about how our programs should develop. Getting back to that idea of community collaboration, we have a lot to learn from what our participants are going to tell us.
Yes. I can see that Elizabeth wants to jump in, right?
Yeah, just taking on what Stephen has said, as I said in my presentation, the virus is of particular concern to older audience, many of whom are the regular museum visitors. So maybe we can make other adjustments, like opening up the museum earlier in the day for people who are over 65 or 70, have safe places for them so that they can move, without the rest of the audience. So they can. There's a sense of security in that, and a sense of safeness in that. So. And also putting information, as I said, both on the website and the actual physical space of the museum, because a lot of people, will visit the website of the museum before they attend to see what's on. So having all this information on the website actually prepares people for their visit. and it calms them down. So all these measures, like not everyone being allowed in the gallery at the same time, or that everything is sanitized, the personnel is wearing masks, even positive social media posts invite people back. So it's little things that we can do that make a big difference, I think.
Спасибо, очень важно это.
Thank you very much. This is a really important thing to add. The next question will be for Dinara. Dinara, what do you think? How do audiences see the therapeutic resource of museums? You've spoken about the fears and barriers that may prevent people from coming. So could you please speak more about that? Yes. I think that in Russia, now we see an increase in inclusive programs, and more and more people come to museums in general. So that means that people learn more about the social agenda of museums. But if we look at the scale of the whole country, I think an important goal for our museum community is informing people, communicating what we do, and making information as accessible as possible for all groups of visitors. The goal of our program is to communicate that museums are open, museums are accessible. We seek to open a dialogue, but we see that many public associations or public organizations that work with all of these groups of people don't know anything about museum programs. All they see online is very abstract. So they can't actually engage with museums because they don't see any invitation from the museums. So this is why many of such associations and such institutions remain closed, and they don't open up for museums. And I agree with what Elizabeth has just said. Really, it's extremely important to inform visitors, to address them, to explain that museums do have therapeutic resources for them, not to have it, as a declaration, as a manifesto, but to communicate it to the people. And the final question, because we don't have much time, unfortunately, will be for Roman. Roman, you spoke about rethinking collective and personal trauma. You spoke about memories, and one of the questions we had, does the Gulag Museum collaborate with therapists and psychologists, and how do you work with trauma? We do have special programs where we collaborate with psychologists and therapists. These are programs run by experts. We do that in 3 areas. One is for volunteers. The other program is for the people who went through camps, the people will be helped. And the third area was a series of talks about how trauma is passed on from one generation to another. These lectures were delivered by psychologists, and they caused a lot of interest from the public. As for professional psychologists, we do collaborate with them, but for specific programs. As for exhibition design, when we design exhibition, we collaborate with lots of people, lots of experts. And I think that when we do brainstorm ideas, we engage all kinds of people, including museum experts and experts in trauma, in traumatic memories. Every time we have to deal with these hard issues, we still cause a lot of public debates. One of the topics is, for example, victims and persecutors. Who is the victim and who is the prosecutor? Some of the relatives of our visitors maybe were part of the repressive organs, and how should they treat their heritage? What should they think of their memories of their past? So we can't really calculate all the risks, or we can't calculate the output of our programs, how many people manage to rethink their past or their heritage. Here, all I can rely on is our research and feedbacks from our audiences, and also the research that our partners carry out. So I think that all our actions are based on our beliefs. We believe that what we do propels our society, moves our society towards rethinking its own past.
Thank you very much. As our time is up, I would like to express my gratitude to our colleagues, Elizabeth, Steven, Roman, Dinara. I think that they made really brilliant presentations, and their presentations show to us the important role of a museum for the society. When we talk about sustainable development, and one of the indices of sustainable development is the well-being of the society, moral and physical well-being, and museums play a very important role in this process. I would like to remind you of my first question addressed to our audience. I would like to learn what is your opinion, what is your position. If you work in a museum, what is your professional attitude and professional position? If you make part of our museum visitors, it is also important for us to know what do you think about what we discussed today. I would like to express my gratitude to the Potanin Foundation once again for the organization of this discussion, because we discussed very important topics. We discussed the topic of competences, personal stories. We talked about a huge number of themes. I hope that this discussion was interesting to you. For me, it was really very interesting, and I would like to wish you a very good day, and please be safe.